This is Culloden Moor, situated on the outskirts of Inverness in the Scottish Highlands. It was here where Bonnie Prince Charlie, on the 16th of April 1746, made his last stand with his Jacobite supporters against the Hanoverians, led by the Duke of Cumberland. A man who has gone down in history as Butcher Cumberland, a name given to him following his bloody reprisals in Scotland, following the defeat of the Jacobites in Culloden. It was here on this moor where the last pitched battle in Britain would be fought. You might assume, thanks to writers such as Sir Walter Scott, that the Battle of Culloden was about Scotland versus England, Highlander against Lowlander, Protestant against Catholic. But in truth, more Scots were fighting on the Hanoverian side than they were for the Bonnie Prince. To think it's Scotland versus England is to completely misunderstand the political landscape of Europe in the 18th century, which led to the Battle of Culloden. The Jacobite rebellion was simply a sideshow in a pan-European civil war called the War of the Austrian Succession, which would run from around 1740 to 1748. It surrounded the next heir to the throne of Austria, Marie Theresa, who was Catholic. Britain supported her in that claim, but the French wanted to uphold Salic law, which said that women could not inherit. As with much of history, the British and the French were at each other's throats on just about every political and military front. The French decided to create trouble for the British by instigating a rebellion in Scotland as a diversionary tactic, in the hope that the British troops would be sent home to deal with an anti-British uprising aimed against the Hanoverian crown, giving the French breathing space to further their interests in the Austrian succession crisis. The old pretender, James Francis Edward Stuart, had a genuine claim on the British throne. He had been part of previous rebellions in Britain. The name Jacobite comes from the Latin translation Jacobus, meaning James. Now, James Stuart, also known as the Old Pretender, decided to send his son Charles Edward Stuart in his place, as he was getting on in his years. And if the rebellion had been successful, it's very likely Charles would have sent for his father to take what he saw as his rightful place on the throne, and not the Bonnie Prince himself. The Stuarts were living on the continent at the time and in exile ever since the glorious rebellion of 1688. There's a long history behind why the Stuarts eventually left Britain, but the main takeaway for this story is that with the promised French backing, the Bonnie Prince was dispatched for Britain to stir the pot and to cause trouble. For the Bonnie Prince, it was about putting a Stuart back on the throne. For the French, it was simply a sideshow to distract the British on the continent. For the Bonnie Prince, the promised French backing never appeared, and other than the loyalty of the Jacobites, he was very much on his own. There were all sorts of counsel given to the Bonnie Prince not to fight. They had just come from a brutal night march in hopes of surprising the Royalist army, which just didn't happen. The troops hadn't been fed for several days and were sleepless and exhausted, to say the very least. At around 1 p.m. on the 16th of April 1746, the Prince decided to roll the dice and to fight. The battle was on. The Jacobites formed into ranks onto Culloden Moor. The Royalists on the opposing side got into position and awaited their orders. As the battle started, the Royalists fired from their artillery, grape shot, bags filled with musket balls which acted like a giant shotgun towards the Jacobite line. Charlie's men stood steady just before firing their own single-shot muskets towards the Royalists. Once this was done, they would drop their muskets and pull out their swords and start the famous Highlander charge. But the distance between them was a long way, and this was to take the shock element out of the attack. Besides the distance, they were running into musket and cannon fire. The air was thick with lead, and by all accounts, torrential rain hammering down all around them. As they headed towards the Hanoverian line, the ground beneath them, foggy and wet, sucking at their feet and slowing down the momentum. The heather and natural ditches and holes on the battlefield made traversing the distance that much more difficult. Exhausted and aware of the dead who lay behind them, the Jacobites attacked the Royalists' soldiers. It was hand-to-hand fighting, swords and bayonets stabbing and slicing. The noise must have been thunderous, with the clashing of steel, the war cries of the soldiers, the screaming of the men dying as the blood of both sides soaked into the ground. On the Jacobite right, it was a close-run thing. The Jacobites making the kind of impact that would have been needed to turn the battle in their favour. Death and butchery all around, but the drill and professional soldiery of the Royalists won out, and the battle was to end in defeat for the Jacobites. Historians are somewhat mixed on how long the battle lasted. Some say around 45 minutes, others believe it was a work of minutes. However long it lasted, it put a full stop to the Jacobite uprisings for good, and never again would red-coated soldiers be asked to fight a pitched battle on British soil. In the aftermath of the battle, the reprisals were to be brutal. After all, this was seen as a rebellion against the king and crown and the establishment. In other words, it was seen as treason. The Duke of Cumberland, who was a cousin of Bonnie Prince Charlie, ordered a brutal retaliation on those who had fought at the battle and those suspected Jacobite sympathisers, and on anyone who had given them succour. The Bonnie Prince had made good his escape from Culloden. For months he was hidden throughout Scotland to avoid capture by the Hanoverian soldiers, nearly being caught several times. On September the 20th, 1746, dressed as a maid, Charlie eventually made his escape back to France thanks to the help of Flora MacDonald. He got on a ship and made passage for France. He would never return to Britain, and the Jacobite cause came to an end. The name Charlie is an English mishearing of the Gaelic form of Charles. The idea that the men around him called him Charlie is not true. The men within the Jacobite army spoke Gaelic, and it would have sounded similar to Cherlich, and it's simply a case that English speakers who heard the soldiers shouting Cherlich thought it sounded like Charlie, and the rest is history. I personally don't speak Gaelic, so I will have butchered that name, but the fact remains it's simply a mishearing by the English speaking men around him, and the name stuck. So instead of Bonnie Prince Charlie, it's probably more likely Bonnie Prince Cherlich. Over the years there's been much careful effort made into making the battlefield look like it would have done on the day of the battle, planting specific flowers and shrubbery onto the moor, and at one point there was a road that led straight through and past the clan grave markers here. This was eventually rerouted some years back, and the road has now been grassed over. But if you look, you can still see where the camber of the road used to be. These boulders with the names of the clans who fought and died here were placed here by the landowner in the 1880s, likely put here because of folk memory from the 18th century, suggesting that the mass graves of the Jacobite and Hanoverian dead were buried within the vicinity. Archaeologists have used ground-penetrating radar to try and detect where the actual graves are located, but to this day the graves have not yet been found. The graves will certainly be within the area of the battlefield, and perhaps one day they will be discovered. This building here is called Lonak cottage, believed to be built in the early 18th century. It's situated on the grounds of the battlefield and was here during the Battle of Culloden. At one time there would have been many such buildings in this area, likely used as a small holding held by tenants on an estate. This is the only surviving example of this type of building in this landscape. The cottage was situated between the government lines and likely used as a field hospital for the government men. If this building could speak, imagine the stories it could tell of what had happened, what it had seen and heard. The screams of the dying, the cannon fire and shouting of men, horse hoofs thundering by, the atrocities that occurred here. It's easy to imagine the echoes of the battle being entombed within the stone of the building. The horror of that day hanging on the joists like spiderwebs attached to branches being blown in the wind. With a little imagination and silence standing within the building, it can transport you to another time. Allow you to picture the two armies standing on opposing sides of the battlefield. The bonny prince on his horse rolling the dice against the royalist forces, and the brutality that would follow after the Jacobite defeat at the Battle of Culloden. For me, the battlefield at Culloden is unique. I have visited several battlefields in the past, but it's here where you truly feel the atmosphere. When you look across the battlefield, there are flags on both sides. One represents where the Jacobites stood, and on the other where the well-trained red-coated royalists stood, positioned with their artillery and muskets, bayonets attached, awaiting for the start of the battle. I highly recommend a visit here. It's an extremely interesting location with a fantastic new visitor centre on the location with a cafe and tours available for those who are interested. I truly hope you enjoyed my video, and I'll see you on the next one.